Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and I have literally just walked back in the door from having been to see Avengers Infinity War. In this video, I'm going to share my thoughts with you about the film. For those who are wondering, there are going to be some spoilers, but they're going to come at the end of this video, and I'm going to give you a big, fat, juicy spoiler warning and a time code so you can avoid those. So if you want to hear my thoughts, there's going to be plenty of thoughts that are non-spoiler, and I'll share all of those before I get into spoiler territory, and I'll give you a big, fat warning, so don't panic. You can hang around for the first part. Basically, in a nutshell, before going into this film, there are a couple of things that I was intrigued by. Number one, I was intrigued by how they were going to handle such a huge ensemble cast in this film. This is a movie with the biggest cohort of Avengers that we have ever seen put together all in one place, all in one film on screen. And each of these Avengers, or teams, if you think about the Guardians of the Galaxy, they are mega stars who can hold a movie in their own right. So it was a pretty difficult ask to put all of them together in one film and to make it work without turning it into like a 6-hour film. And Marvel actually managed to do a relatively good job of this. In some of the previous films, this has been a bit of a weakness when you get such a large group of people together, but they actually do it relatively well in this film. And the way they do it is they break them into teams. And effectively, you follow different teams on their various little adventures that sort of culminate together in a crescendo. And I thought that was a really clever way of doing it. There are one or two moments where you find yourself stopping and asking yourself, now, hold on a minute, what's going on here? Who am I with right now? But overall, you know, it's not too dramatic to follow along the storylines, the various storylines and the way that they intersect. And you don't have too much trouble. There's just, as I said, one or two little moments where you have to stop and check yourself and just sort of remember where you're at and who you're following at this particular moment. The one thing I think the movie did lack, though, was a central character whose story we followed through this film. There is no one single character thread that sort of ties everything together. There's lots of little interesting character threads that could have perhaps been utilised a bit better. Tony Stark comes close at one point of being the sort of the main character, and it's sort of his journey. It's through his eyes that we sort of track this little adventure with these different groups. But there's not really enough time spent with him, and they have to divert away at different times. So it just, to me, that was one thing. I don't know how they could have done it, but it's the one thing looking back at the other end of the film I think that it could have done with. Because what I think that would have done was given just a little bit more emotional gravity to some of the moments. And there are some big emotional moments in here, but they don't quite pay off, I think, because you have to flick around so often and you're not following one character consistently through the whole film. So you just keep changing your point of view effectively on the story. And I think that does have a bearing on some of the big emotional impacts. But overall, they do a pretty good job. I think this is the best example of them actually taking an ensemble cast that is this big and actually making a coherent film out of it, where you actually feel that everyone gets, you know, roughly enough screen time. There's one or two characters perhaps you could have done with a little bit more, particularly if you're going to sort of have some of these big emotional payoffs, but overall I think they do a pretty good job of it. The second thing that intrigued me before I went into this film was how they were going to handle Thanos, because I don't think it's any secret, and I don't think it's unfair to say that Thanos is probably been one of the most underwhelming as far as an introduction and a preempting villain that Marvel's had. He's supposed to be the big major menace, but they haven't really done a lot of setup before you go into this film. And that was one thing I was wondering about, is how are they actually going to make this pay off? Because they haven't really set a lot up. They've given us just little glimmers here or there, and yet the whole time he's supposed to be this major menace, the ultimate menace in the universe, but he hasn't really been set up in a substantial way like that. They've just sort of hinted at that. But they actually managed to pull it off relatively okay in this film. There are things about him that I think are a little bit imperfect, especially when you consider the other thing too that I wondered about going into this film was, if you look at Thanos, he does look a lot like a Saturday morning kids cartoon villain. And I really wondered to myself how they were going to actually make this work and give him menace. But they do it. They actually do it. And they manage to make it work. He has enough menace and enough menace about him, and there's enough that's interesting about him. When I get into the spoiler territory, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the character of Thanos and the way that they have chosen to portray him, because it's not quite what I expected going into this film, and I'm a little bit conflicted about it. But what I liked about Thanos was he's interesting. He is not what I expected. He's not a typical Marvel sort of Armageddon type villain, and that's what I thought he was going to be. There's actually a bit more going on there. As I said, I am also a little bit conflicted about that bit more that's going on there, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But I think they managed to do something that I wasn't sure they were going to be able to do, and that was give a sense of menace around him. It's not perfect. There are still some issues. Basically, I would say that this film is one of Marvel's better outings. I think it's far superior to Civil War. It seems like maybe they have listened and learned, or they have done their own proper debrief and analysis about the problems in Civil War, and they have certainly, I think, learned from them in this film. The humour was great. Apart from one recycled joke, there is one joke that is lifted directly from Civil War, and they change one aspect of the joke, but they use the exact same joke. And I remember at the time thinking, why have they done this? I was a bit frustrated by that, but thankfully, that's the worst you could say about the humour. The rest of it is appropriate. There's one or two little moments where you think, was this the right place for humour? But this is Marvel, and it's not like Star Wars, and it actually works, and there's enough of it to sort of break up and bring levity into some of the more serious moments of the film, and it actually works. It doesn't go too far, if you like, with the humour, and often, even though it might be a more serious moment, it doesn't feel too hammy or too out of place. As I said, there was one joke that was recycled, which I thought was really frustrating, but other than that, there's some pretty good humorous moments in there. There's one or two schmaltzy moments, but overall, it avoids the sort of cliched sentimentality. And I was wondering again how they were going to do this, and whether there was going to be some big group hugs and reunions. There's one or two little reunion moments, but they work. The moment where Peter Parker officially becomes one of the team, I thought that was really cool, the way that was handled. It wasn't over the top and schmaltzy. There was these emotional moments that were there, and they did them well. The one thing that's probably a little bit lacking in the film is some emotional depth, and that's where I think that if they'd followed perhaps one character a bit more strongly, then maybe that emotional depth would have been a bit more present. There's some big emotional moments there, but it just feels like the depth that should belong to those moments is perhaps a little bit lacking. There are no major talk fests, unlike Civil War, which got bogged down and just came to a grinding halt in places. It was just like almost like a bureaucratic meeting at times, discussing some of these big high concepts around whether or not or how they should be governed, but there's none of that in this film. This film avoids those slow down moments, and what it does, I think, really wisely is basically it gets most of the expositional stuff that it needs to get done. It does that at the beginning of the film. And it's really interesting the way they do some of it. I really liked the role of the Guardians of the Galaxy in this. It actually, earlier on in the film, it feels like a Guardians movie. And some of that stuff in space is really quite cool. And so there's a bit of exposition, and I think probably from memory, they have one of the more expositional scenes with a lot more dialogue than most others. But overall, they get most of that stuff out of the way, and then the film really builds into quite a strong action climax. It doesn't stop from that point. But overall, it does a pretty good job of that. However, there's a caveat to this, and what I've often found with Marvel movies is you watch them the first time, and because all of the dialogue and the exposition is so new, you don't notice so much. But then you go back for a second or a third viewing, and suddenly you notice that a lot of the dialogue it's just a bit too dialogue heavy. If you go back now and watch the first Avengers film, you really notice how slow that is in places. So I do wonder to myself whether I'm still, because I'm only on my first viewing, whether or not if I go back a second or third time, I might notice a bit more of that dialogue. But I certainly didn't feel too dialogue heavy. Basically, this movie is one long chase scene. That's really what this is. This is one long chase. This is one long heist movie. Thanos is trying to pull off the heist of the century, the heist of the universe. I don't know what you call it in this context. And the Avengers are chasing him down to try and prevent this from happening. And it works. It actually works pretty well. So basically, all the people who hated on Mad Max Fury Road because they didn't think it had enough substance and it was too much of a chase film, effectively, this is Mad Max Fury Road, Avengers style. The bad guy wants the stuff, and you've got his stuff, and there's a big chase on to get the stuff. And it works though, it actually works. And I think this was a smart way to do it. As I said, the one big thing that might have pulled it all together was that single character thread, or a bit more of a stronger character thread, just to give the emotional moments a bit more depth and a bit more payoff. This is, so far, probably Marvel's darkest film yet. With one caveat, and I'll talk more about the caveat I have when I get into spoiler territory. But I think getting to the end of this film, some fans might be a little bit angry, because this is kind of like an Empire Strikes Back cliffhanger moment, this movie. But the way they do it, I would argue, it's even darker and more uncertain than what Empire Strikes Back gave us. And so I think some people initially are going to be a bit angry about the way that it comes to this sort of cliffhanger conclusion, this big uncertain question mark hanging over everything. However, having said that, I think give it a bit of time, and I think people will realise actually this is a pretty good outing from Marvel, because they've made the stakes real. And they give you an ending that has some substance. It's not just a nice, neat, pretty superhero, everyone's safe and the day has been saved by the good guys type ending. There's a bit more going on here. And so I think those who might be a little bit angry initially, if they give it a bit more time, I think they will come to see that this is actually a pretty good way to end this film. The one last thing I will say before I get into spoiler territory is this. For those who are wondering about whether or not there is SJW propaganda in this film, don't panic. There's actually none of that political stuff in this movie. It's actually really, really good and very refreshing to go into a movie that is supposed to be a good old-fashioned piece of mindless escapism and to discover that it is just that. It's a good old-fashioned piece of mindless escapism. There's not all these political barbs loaded into the film. It was actually really good. So that's a big plus. There are two moments that I'm pretty confident, I'll be willing to bet money on this, that within the next 7 days or so, there will be a Mother Jones or a BuzzFeed article or someone on Vox is going to write about these two big feminist moments, and there's going to be these articles crowing about them. Did you see that moment? Did you see that moment in the Avengers Infinity War? It was a big feminist moment. And the two moments to look out for are, there's a young female Wakandan scientist who has a discussion with Bruce Banner about something, very brief, and there is also another moment where you have three female team members who are fighting together, and I'm almost certain now I can just see one of those I'm with her type stories where they try and weave that into this particular fight. But as I said, it is not politically loaded, it's not obvious, it's not in your face. It was really refreshing to have that kind of movie experience where you go in for a bit of escapism and you actually come out having had an escapist experience. Right, with that out of the way, I'm now going to get into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen the film and you don't want anything ruined, in a moment there is going to be a time code that appears on screen and you need to jump to that time code in order to avoid the spoiler talk. If you have already seen the film or you don't mind spoilers, then stick around, I'll be back in a moment. Right, for those who are still here, consider yourself well and truly warned because we're about to jump into spoilers. Like I said earlier, the character of Thanos was not what I was expecting, and I'm a little bit conflicted about that. I like the fact that he was not your typical Armageddon type, must enslave the world, must destroy the universe type villain. That's what I was expecting, but he's not that. Instead, he is a dangerous environmentalist nutjob. And what he wants to do is he wants to commit an act of genocide in order to slaughter a whole lot of people throughout the universe in order to free up resources and to free up space. And he believes that he is basically on a humanitarian mission. He believes he is going to help the universe by committing this act of mass genocide. And he doesn't want to be king, he doesn't want to be in charge, he just wants to sink back into the shadows and bask in the warm afterglow, as he describes it, of knowing that he did a good thing by killing a whole lot of people and helping the universe in the process. He's different. I like the fact it's different. I really like that take on things. He's this dangerous, evil, genocidal environmentalist. And I like that concept. However, why I'm a little bit conflicted about this villain is because I think they've tried to give him a little bit too much emotional weight in the relationship with his daughter Gamora. And why I think that's a problem is because I think that it undercuts the horror that we should feel about him as a villain. Basically, someone who wants to kill people because they are evil and maniacal, that makes sense. But a villain who wants to kill people and who believes that by committing genocide they are saving the world or saving people, they are a truly frightening and horrific kind of prospect because it doesn't quite compute. You've got humanitarian aims mixed in with grave evil, and it's a really frightening combination, but you never feel that with Thanos. And I think part of the problem is because they have made him a little bit too emotionally complex. I never thought I would say this about a Marvel villain, but I think that they've made him a little bit too emotionally complex in the relationship that he has with his daughter Gamora. And so effectively he feels like a pretty reasonable kind of guy who's just got one really bad idea about how to solve all the universe's problems. And the problem is that that means that you don't sort of feel that sense of terror and dread. You should really look at this villain, I think, and be really horrified by what he stands for, but you never really feel that. And I think that's a real shame, and it undercuts the character. However, as I said, I'm conflicted because I really love the fact that they have written this character as a nutjob environmentalist and not as this typical or prototypical Armageddon type villain. It's quite a refreshing take on things. Another thing I found frustrating about the character of Thanos was the CG. Now, overall in this film, the CG is pretty good. There is one scene towards the end of the movie where Bruce Banner is in the Hulkbuster armor and the top of the Hulkbuster Iron Man suit is off, and so you can actually see Bruce Banner's sort of head and shoulder region, and it doesn't look right. I don't know why it doesn't look right. Maybe he's not to scale, or it looks like it might be a bit of a bad cut and paste job, but it just doesn't look right. And I remember seeing it at the time, and it was really jarring, and it pulled me out of the film. It really stuck out because the rest of the effects in this, they look pretty seamless. However, there are some issues around Thanos, in particular his face. The uncanny valley effect definitely makes its presence felt at several key moments in this film. And it's a bit frustrating because it pulls you out of the film, it pulls you out of some of those key moments. The one thing I wish Marvel had done differently with Thanos is I wish that they had sat down years ago and thought a bit more about practical effects versus CG for his character. He looks cartoonish. I really wish that what they'd done was they'd actually gone with a man in a suit or a decent prosthetic or a decent bit of makeup work or something like that, with perhaps a little bit of CG augmenting the actor's actual performance, because having him as a CG face, as I said, at times the uncanny valley is really present, at times he just looks too cartoonish, and you sort of miss the depth that you really want with that character. I mean, this is their big tent villain. He is the super villain, right? And so it's a little bit frustrating, and I think it is a bit of a shame that he's not quite as up to spec when he appears on screen as what I think he could be. The last thing I found frustrating about this film was the act of genocide that happens at the end of the movie. Basically, I think they genocided, they killed far too many of the superheroes. Too many of our main characters were killed in that act of genocide. Now, I know that might sound strange because I talk a lot about the fact that you want to make sure that you have stakes that feel real. You know, the danger has to feel real in these kind of films. However, in this case, killing so many of our superheroes, and when you combine that fact with the fact that Doctor Strange has already effectively spoiled things for us by telling us that he's been to the future and he's seen all the possible outcomes, and he tells us that this was the one path that they had to chart in order to ensure victory, you know that those characters are not going to remain dead. And so the impact that they were trying to go for by having so many of them die, it's undercut. Look, I'm confident that Marvel, that Disney is not going to leave such valuable intellectual properties dead. I don't think they're going to do that. I'll be really impressed if they do. It'll be quite an amazing moment in cinematic history if they actually decide that this is how these characters are going to meet their demise. But I seriously doubt that. We know, for example, that there's going to be another Guardians film. Well, that means that a lot of those characters have to be in that film. So unless they're going to tell some sort of backstory, we've got to get those characters back. We know they're coming back. And unfortunately, I think that having so many of them died, I know this sounds a bit contradictory, but it actually undercut the impact of the sacrifice. I feel like perhaps if they'd had one or two key characters, one or two characters that left you with a question mark, I think that would have been a far better cliffhanger. But because so many of them died, another part of or aspect of so many of them dying is that you don't really have time for any one character to suddenly to really have an impact on you. It's like, oh, that guy's going, and that guy, and that girl, oh, she's going, he's going. It's like everyone's going. And so the impact of the sacrifice is lost a little bit because so many people are being sacrificed. The other thing I would say is that the CG in this part of the film, I thought was a bit of an odd choice. To me, it felt a little bit dated. The way in which those characters disappear into the ether during this genocide, I don't know, it just felt a little bit cheap. I think that maybe they could have spent a little bit more creative focus on finding a way for them to have their lives ended where it didn't feel like leaves disappearing and blowing into the wind. I don't know. To me, it was an odd choice, and at the time, it sort of stuck out a little bit for me, and I remember thinking, is this the way you chose to do this? There's plenty of other ways you could have done this, and we've seen some pretty impressive special effects in this film already, and this is the way they chose to portray this big key moment of sacrifice. However, having said all that, like I said earlier, I think this is one of Marvel's better outings. This is a movie that takes a huge ensemble cast of characters and does a pretty bang-up job of putting together a coherent, well-paced, engaging story where the motivations and what's going on screen makes sense. There's a bit of humor in there, there's a bit of depth in places, and there is also that big budget blockbuster spectacle that we all love. There are one or two flaws, and you can definitely pick at the seams of things here and there, but overall I think this is a vast improvement from, say, something like Captain America Civil War. They seem to have learned from the mistakes in that movie and really tidied things up for this film. It's well worth watching. I enjoyed going to see it. If you're a Marvel fan, there is plenty in there that I think you're going to love. And even if you're not a Marvel fan, this is still a good wall-to-wall chase movie that works really, really well. The cliffhanger moment, it's going to be interesting to see how that's received once this hits the world theatres, and how many people are going to be annoyed by this versus how many people are going to be really happy that they've actually finally given a meaningful ending to a Marvel movie that leaves us with a bit of a cliffhanger, albeit, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps a little bit spoiled. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts though, so please let me know in the comment section below whether you agree or disagree. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. A huge thank you to all the people who are appearing on screen right now, who have contributed to Left Foot Media this month. You guys are awesome. It's great to know that you're in my corner. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.